Hello. To the graduates and their family members, friends, and supporters, welcome to the first ever virtual awards and honors ceremony hosted by the Political Science Department. My name is Stephen Nelson, and I'm an associate professor of political science and the director of the honors program. We're glad that you're sharing your time with us this morning to celebrate the graduates and their many accomplishments. I recognize that it's a solemn time for an event like this. I stand in solidarity with Black and Brown students grieving after the killings of George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, Tony McDade, Rayshard Brooks, and the innumerable other lives that were extinguished because of the scourge of anti-Blackness. The vast inequities in American society have been further exposed by the disproportionate burden of losses borne by marginalized communities during the COVID-19 pandemic. I also acknowledge that members of our community are struggling to cope with painful losses, the illnesses and deaths of family members and friends, and the disruption of livelihoods and ensuing precarities that have imposed heavy burdens on so many people. These are difficult, disorienting times, but I've found cause for hopefulness through the energy and bravery of the Northwestern students that I'm privileged to have taught and from whom I've learned so much. It's inspiring to see how hard, tragic circumstances have not immobilized students, but rather has spurred them to action. The achievements of the graduates that we celebrate today exemplify the remarkable work that our students have done and continue to do inside and beyond the classrooms and research sites. We're grateful to the graduates for all they've done to create and share knowledge and for their efforts to reshape policy and practices in communities across the world. We're proud of each of you and very excited to follow your work as it continues in the future. Before we move to the next part of the program, I'd like to take a moment to recognize the department's remarkable administrators whose efforts have proved so valuable to our students and faculty members during this most unusual and turbulent year. The department's lead business administrator, Stephen Monteiro, our undergraduate program coordinator, Libby Waite, Courtney Siskowski, our graduate program coordinator, and Erica Canavan and Amila Mevich, our program assistants. They've been the glue binding together the parts that make this department work. So on behalf of all of us, thank you, Stephen, Libby, Courtney, Erica, and Amila. Next, we're going to recognize the achievements of our honor students. In addition to sustaining a high grade point average in political science coursework, these students successfully completed a thesis project. Honor students work closely with a faculty advisor to complete an original research project that makes a substantial contribution to knowledge. Students formulate a motivating research question, craft a rigorous research design, read and analyze the relevant literature, formulate a theoretical framework, collect and analyze data. And the end product of all this effort is a lengthy, in some cases very lengthy, thesis. Each of our honors thesis students will next introduce their projects, and then we'll briefly discuss their findings and the implications of their research. We're going to go in alphabetical order. So I'm going to start with Jonathan Goldberg, whose thesis title is Game of Drones, the Effect of Drone Strikes on Terrorists' Tactical Diversity. Thanks, Jonathan.
Thank you very much, Professor Nelson. And before I start describing my thesis, I just want to thank the remainder of the political science faculty for an amazing 4 years in this program, as well as you, Professor Nelson, and you specifically, Professor Reno, being my advisor on this thesis project for just an amazing experience overall and a great way to cap off my senior year. So to quickly give you a brief synopsis on the thesis project that I spent most of my senior year on. As my title explains, the primary relationship that I'm looking at in my thesis is how drone strikes, a common counterterrorism tactic used by the United States, affects the tactical diversity of terrorist organizations. That is, more specifically, how many different targets do terrorists attack in a given year, and how many types of tactics do they use, i.e., does a terrorist organization, after being under the threat of a drone campaign, start to use more tactics? Do they use IEDs and assassination attempts and gun violence, or do they start to lessen that portfolio and maybe only start to use IEDs or only attack police forces and government buildings instead of civilians and religious institutions as well. And the reason I tacked this research question is because it really helps answer something that was missing in the prior literature. That is, it answers why and how drone strikes may succeed or fail in a counterterrorism as a counterterrorism tactic. Many other research opportunities into the area of drone strikes focus on what I'd like to call very overhead statistics. You know, how many attacks do terrorists contribute in a given year, and how many people do those attacks kill. But I think that the benefit of looking at an organization's tactical diversity is that it shows you the quality or the color to which those groups are attacking. Specifically, if we have a better understanding of how they diversify or why a group is diversifying their tactical portfolio, we have a better understanding of whether, for instance, a high number of attacks in a given year from a terrorist organization is more indicative of that organization falling apart in the long run, or whether the organization is actually much stronger and therefore able to contribute more attacks. So I think it adds a bit more information than prior studies on drone strikes are able to use, and can help policymakers in the long run have a better understanding of how drone strikes affect our security situations and the terrorist groups that we're trying to limit the threat of. To tackle this question, I created a custom data set out of data collected by the New American Foundation, the Bureau of Investigative Journalism, and the Global Terrorism Database. Using that data, I was then able to run a series of linear regressions and ordered logit models to determine specifically the statistical relationship in a large N case study between the variables that I previously talked about. Then that was supplemented with a case study of how drones affected the Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula in Yemen in 2012. Briefly, my findings went on the quantitative scale showed that there was a positive relationship between drone strikes and a terrorist organization's tactical diversity. That is, a terrorist organization not only increased the amount of tactics they used in a given year, they also increased the amount of targets to which they attacked in a given year. Showing that across the board on the large level, we saw that drone strikes are more likely to increase the tactical diversity of a terrorist organization, and was predictable in the data according to this analysis was that terrorist groups often move from limited and targeted attacks against their enemies. For example, as was shown in the case study, Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, before the drone campaign came against them, was very discriminate in who they attacked. They would attack very limited number of civilians and only attack military targets or government officials who stood against them. But as a drone campaign really inflicted damage upon the organization and attacked many of its leaders, we saw that Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula actually began to attack more civilians. And what this type of case study shows just proves the point that I was talking about as to the importance of looking at tactical diversity. That is, it shows that the terrorist organization was feeling less secure in their hold on the region and started to use violence against civilians, which is a very risky tactic, as you can lose the general public support and lose your foothold in an area. But they saw that it was the last-ditch effort they needed in order to maintain their control, and therefore violence against civilians in this case is indicative of drone strikes working in the long run. And so as to the recommendations we can kind of create from this situation is that policymakers really should be cautious when looking at top-line statistics for the outcomes of drone strikes. They need to be a bit more likely to accept critical thinking on the issue, noting that higher deaths against civilians is not always indicative of a program failing. Rather, it can show that in the long run, there's likely to be more success against this terrorist organization.
Great, Jonathan. If I could follow up very briefly, one quick question, just to ask you, in light of all the work you've done for this thesis, which is really remarkable to marry novel quantitative and then a careful qualitative reconstruction of one terror group's selection from its strategic repertoire, which revealed this really strong link between the deployment of an instrument of state power and the targeted group's tactics. Could you say a little bit more about what the evidence that you've collected in this thesis suggests about whether and how the US military planners and policymakers should rethink the use of drone strikes as a tactic?
That's a very good question. And I think I'd have two pieces of advice on that fact. The first would be that the United States really should be using drones in conjunction with other elements of national power, i.e. economic aid, diplomacy, and general state building to increase the ability of local governments to deal with terrorist organizations in the long run. Because as the the top line, the results that I just talked about showed, many times you see that terrorist organizations will expand their tactical portfolio to start attacking civilians. When that happens, the terrorist group's relationship with civilians starts to degrade. So a real strategic key for policymakers to use would be to build a relationship with civilians and the general populace. And that only happens through supporting the local governments. And that's a tactical area where the United States can use the impact of drone strikes to strengthen their security situation in the long run. But the second thing that I would say, and this is currently among the policy decisions that the Trump administration has made, was that the Trump administration is pushing the authority to use drone strikes down the chain of command to lower level military officials, whereas the Obama administration held the go order. Only President Obama had to okay every drone strikes. Now, military officials, who are often unelected, are ones who can okay drone strikes. And I think that that's critical from not only a moral and legal perspective that can get threatening, but I think specifically from that tactical level, you want the United States to be coordinating with all branches of power, whether that be US aid, the State Department, and many other agencies in the United States. And I think that that coordination just happens better when it's in higher levels of the executive instead of just in the Department of Defense. And so I think that's one real policy decision that can be reversed in future administrations.
That's great. Thanks, Jonathan. Next, we have Alyssa Gray, whose honors thesis was entitled Sexual Violence Survivorship and Victim Blaming in the Congressional Context. Thanks, Alyssa.
Yeah, thank you, Professor Nelson. And so when I started the thesis process, I knew vaguely that I wanted to study the cases of Anita Hill, who, if you don't know, accused Supreme Court nominee Clarence Thomas of sexual harassment in 1991, and compare it with the case of Christine Blasey Ford, who accused Brett Kavanaugh of sexual assault in 2018. And so with the help of my advisor, Professor Birch, I narrowed it down to studying the question of victim blaming, the role of victim blaming in the questions that senators targeted towards the survivors, Blasey Ford and Anita Hill, during their testimonies in front of during the confirmation hearing process, in order to see if there was a shift across time using the measure of victim blaming, and to see if there had been any change in how survivors are basically treated in these confirmation hearings in the 27 span between the two cases. And so part of this, my theory was that hopefully that victim blaming would decrease across the two cases. And part of that was required studying cultural climate and seeing how cultural climate had changed from 1991 to 2018. And while I took a lot part of my research was studying a lot of polls, surveys, I came up with this overall argument using Ann Swidler's theory of culture, that in 1991, we were in a settled period of culture, basically, where conversations around sexual violence were not happening as readily in the mainstream as they were in 2018, which I classified as an unsettled period of time, basically as a result of the Me Too movement, social media, a bunch of factors where conversations about sexual violence were happening more readily and were directly impacting basically social scripts and how people reacted, which would lead to a decrease in victim blaming because people would be more aware of the kind of tactics they were using when talking to survivors of sexual violence. And so with that, I did a content analysis of the two testimonies, specifically when Anita Hill and Christine Blasey Ford, only their testimonies. And I found an overall decrease in victim blaming across the two cases, but specifically the decrease happened majority in the Democratic Party. So while the Democrats victim blamed less in Christine Blasey Ford's, the Republicans actually victim blamed more in comparison to Anita Hill's case. And so with these findings, I kind of focused on three different conversations. I talked about polarization and the correlation between political party identity and victim blaming and rape myths, basically trying to answer the question of why did Democrats victim blame less over time and why did Republicans increase. Part of that also include a conversation about gender and racial and ethnic dynamics. Between 1991, when the Senate Judiciary Committee was all male and all white, there was a very marginal increase in diversity from 2018, but that increase happened majority in the Democratic Party. So a conversation about if that had some effect on whether or not why the victim blaming was less prevalent in the Democratic Party was part of that. And then finally, the crux of my discussion was basically talking about optics and performativity and whether this decrease in victim blaming, even though it's very important, there was still significant victim blaming in Christine Blasey Ford's case, and wondering if even the decrease was a result of genuine like change and like people are actually like feeling this sincere effects of wanting to support survivors in their hearts, or if it's just an act of performativity, knowing that it would look bad if they have a replay of what happened with Anita Hill and social media and everything, and these terrible clips of just like attacking a survivor of sexual violence on camera does not look so good, and kind of discussing what the role of performativity in that regard. And overall, the whole point in my thesis was basically to just start a conversation about studying the impact and the role of sexual violence survivorship in the political sphere. I used Supreme Court nominees because I thought it was something that had really not been studied when these two cases happening 27 years apart are the only two cases of sexual violence survivors coming forward in regard to the Supreme Court. But as we can see now with our own president, with many politicians, this is happening across the United States, and kind of seeing how that might play out in the future.
It's great. Thanks so much, Alyssa. So I also want to follow up, just to preview, I'm going to do this with all of our honors thesis students. You've conducted the first, to my knowledge, sustained and systematic comparison of two survivors' public testimonies in the context of Supreme Court nominations. And as you described very effectively in your distillation of your thesis, one of the key concepts in your work is the degree to which the American cultural landscape at a given point in time is either settled or unsettled. And it certainly feels like we're in a period of intensifying cultural unsettlement. So do you think victim blaming or other marginalizing discourse aimed at survivors is likely to further recede in the future?
My gut answer is that, of course, I hope so. And then using my research, I do imagine that there will be less overt victim blaming over time, especially as it comes to public figures like Congress people. My constant analysis showed that there was a clear decrease, but there was still like a strong presence of victim blaming when it came to Christine Blasey Ford's case. And we have to keep in mind that she's very much, I hate using this term, but like the quote unquote perfect victim. She's white, well-educated, reasonably upper class. And so even if like it did decrease, but she still experienced this high experience of victim blaming, we can only imagine how that might affect people with more marginalized identities. And in cases that aren't so publicized, you know, this was broadcast across the United States, just in courtrooms, it would be very different. But still, I think the social pressure of things like the Me Too movement and social media really put pressure and make overt victim blaming, as extreme as it was in Anita Hill's case, less of a desirable thing for public figures, especially in liberal circles. But I think the deeper question really is what I talked about with the performativity, because I don't know, we see it even now with all of with the resurgence of Black Lives Matter activism happening right now, and people having conversations about people's reactions on social media and whether that's a measure of performativity or actual knowledge. I don't know the answer. whether it's in terms of victim blaming or activism on social media. But part of me thinks that even if people and public figures are performing and aren't as authentic, at the very least, the culture has shifted enough, definitely not enough totally, but slightly, so that there is this baseline pressure to perform, and maybe that performing will lead to more sincere understanding of survivors' experiences and social justice issues across.
Great, thanks so much for sharing your work with us, Alyssa. So our next presenter is Patrick Ryan, whose honors thesis is titled Guns and Gridlock, Examining the NRA's Legislative Influence in Congress. Thanks, Patrick.
Hi, everybody. I'd just like to thank everyone for attending this meeting. And so I'd like to begin by kind of discussing what motivated my project. And it was kind of the overarching question of why it seems to be so complicated and difficult for Congress to pass wide-ranging substantive gun control legislation, even in the aftermath of mass shootings. Now, many people tend to just blame the NRA and the strength or the perceived strength that they have in influencing Congress. And that's kind of the assumption that I wanted to investigate. Is the NRA really as strong as they're perceived to be? And if that's true, what specifically is it that makes them so strong? And specifically, I wanted to investigate the NRA's agenda-setting power, which is their ability to control what bills end up on the congressional agenda. Because maybe the true source of their power is not just that they defeat gun control bills in Congress, which they've proven to be successful in time and time again, but that they create a culture of fear in Congress that prevents bills from even being proposed in the first place. So I distilled that general question into a specific research question that I examined through my project, which was, does the NRA's opposition to gun control through its various modes of influence reduce the number of gun control bills proposed in Congress? So in other words, when the NRA is actively opposing gun control legislation in Congress, are there fewer gun control bills proposed in response? I sought to tackle this question using a mixed method research analysis that combined quantitative regression analysis and qualitative case studies. And the case studies focused on 3 salient mass shooting episodes in the last 20 years. Columbine in 1999, Virginia Tech in 2007, and Sandy Hook in 2012. Now, both methods, quantitative and qualitative, relied on the same data set, which was an original data set that I compiled of all gun-related bills proposed in Congress between 1991 and 2018. And that spanned 14 Congresses. My initial search returned over 2,900 bills. And at the outset of this project, it took me about 6 weeks to read through each one and code it as either anti-gun, a bill that tightened gun control regulations, pro-gun, a bill that loosened gun control regulations, or not applicable. So once I was finished with all of the coding, my final coded data set contained about 2,200 pro and anti-gun bills. So for the quantitative portion of my analysis, the data set of bills, of pro and anti-gun bills, served as my dependent variable. For my independent variables, I looked at 3 of the NRA's key modes of influence: their advertising expenditures, their campaign contributions, and their lobbying expenditures. And once I ran the regressions, the results were actually pretty interesting and pretty surprising. I found no consistent correlation between an increase in NRA spending in any of these categories and a decrease in gun control bill proposals. And at first that result was kind of disheartening, but then the more I thought about it, I realized that the lack of a clear correlation is itself an interesting result, because a common presumption is that the NRA derives its power by buying politicians, and it's all based on monetary spending. But my findings suggest that perhaps monetary spending is a much weaker mode of NRA influence than is commonly thought. So then I turned to the qualitative portion and my case studies. And my basic framework for the 3 case studies was to examine, in response to these 3 mass shootings, Columbine, Virginia Tech, and Sandy Hook, I wanted to see how Congress responded in terms of the legislation they were proposing, and also how the NRA responded. So following Columbine and Sandy Hook, Congress responded to public attention and support for gun control laws by pursuing gun control legislation pretty aggressively. In response to the proposed legislation in both cases, the NRA aggressively mobilized its membership to contact members of Congress and express their disapproval through emails, phone calls, and writing letters. And following these mobilization campaigns, which tended to last a couple of months at a time, my data shows a significant decrease in the number of gun control bills proposed in Congress. Now, on the other hand, when Congress failed to pursue gun control legislation in the wake of Virginia Tech, which was my third case study, there was no evidence of NRA mobilization or any change in proposed legislation, proposed gun control legislation. So taken together, these three case studies illustrated a pattern. When Congress responded to mass shootings with gun control legislation, the NRA would often mobilize its membership, and this mobilization would cause a significant decrease in the proposal of gun control legislation. So the main conclusion of my thesis is that I would argue the most potent mode of influence of the NRA has definitely been their ability to mobilize their membership base. Now, the spending may serve to enhance this mode. It's kind of hard to tell from my results alone, but spending alone is not an adequate explanation of the NRA's power. Now, I believe that legislators are aware of the NRA's ability to mobilize. That's not really a revolutionary finding in my research. But what I think a lot of legislators are unaware of is how this mobilization shapes legislative efforts, specifically the proposal of legislation. The NRA's strategic mobilization at key moments allows them to have an outsized influence on the legislative process, while their membership is actually relatively small, even compared to the total number of gun owners in the United States. So in terms of what legislators can do about this issue of gun violence moving forward, they can be consistently more aggressive in pursuing the issue if it's truly important to them. Legislators in purple districts and swing states might run a risk of taking electoral heat for proposing or voting for gun control legislation. But I believe that my evidence shows that the risk is really not as big as they think. The NRA has 5 million members, but there are about 50 million households that own guns in this country. So this comparison illustrates that even if the NRA does aggressively mobilize its membership, NRA members are really a very small proportion of gun owners in total. So to conclude, my research has uncovered the ways in which the NRA tries to keep gun control legislation off the agenda altogether. And I hope that my project is valuable to other scholars studying the NRA and this public policy issue of gun violence. I also hope it's valuable to members of Congress, because an understanding of how the NRA operates will hopefully allow them to aggressively pursue legislation and overcome the gridlock on gun control. So thank you.
It's great. Thank you so much, Patrick. And just to reiterate, based on this really painstaking, extensive research, and you gave a sense of how much pain was staked by collecting all of these legislative bills and coding them, you did something really valuable, which is to identify the most potent forms of influence deployed by this organization. And you gave us just now a really good sense of some of the takeaways or implications for policymakers at the national level about if they have an anti-gun agenda, how they might counter that network of influence that the NRA has been able to activate. So I want to follow up with a slightly different question. And the question has to do with moving down a level of analysis from the national legislature to the local level. Is there any hope for, if you are in favor of gun control, for moving down a level to more local kinds of restrictions? Is there any sense you could derive from your work about whether the NRA would be less potent in its opposition if we move the gun control initiative or agenda down to more local and less national scale initiatives?
Yes, absolutely. And that's actually a point I addressed a little bit in the thesis itself, is that my project largely ignores the influence of the NRA and the gun control battle on the state level, which really is quite a different picture. It's obviously very diverse. There's 50 states, all different legislatures, and all kinds of different dynamics with that. But in the wake of these mass shooting episodes, it actually has proven true that states have been a lot more successful in passing gun control legislation. And while the NRA is definitely active at the state level, should there be a grassroots movement, to pass and propose gun control legislation at the state level, well, the NRA's resources would be very, very thin to cover all of that. So I think that, yes, moving forward, a more effective approach to passing sensible gun control legislation would probably be occurring at the state and local levels.
Great. Thanks so much, Patrick. Our next presenter is Dylan Sachs, whose thesis title is To Preserve Kurdish Autonomy, the United States, the Kurds, and Intervention Against Ethnic Replacement, 1967 to 1979. Thank you, Dylan.
Thank you, Professor Nelson. Good morning, everyone. I want to start off by thanking Professor Nelson, my advisor, Galia Ben Aryeh, and my colleagues in the honors program for their comments on this project, and I look forward to discussing my findings with you all today. My project was originally motivated by trends I saw during my junior year research seminar on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. During that class, I became fascinated by Israeli settlements in the West Bank and the transfer of civilian populations in order to manage a conflict, a practice which I call in my thesis ethnic replacement. It seemed strange to me that these kinds of behaviors persisted in a post-World War II world in which rules and norms were supposed to change the nature of conflict. Why exactly did these practices continue to occur within defined national borders? To answer this question, I chose to look at the responses of what I call hegemonic powers, which are defined as countries that hold a disproportionate amount of power in the international system to ethnic replacement practices. In an ideal world, these states have an interest in upholding the international system as it stands, which would involve interventions to halt such practices. In reality, however, states face multiple pressures, such as the presence of rival hegemons, regional power dynamics, and powerful domestic constituencies that can affect their likelihood of intervention. Usually, these pressures prevent interventions. However, when certain incentives align, a limited intervention becomes possible. To examine the merits of this case, I examined the case of American intervention in Iraq before and during the Second Kurdish Uprising of 1974 to 1975. I chose this case because it involved a series of changes in American incentives, as well as the expressed American desire to help preserve Kurdish numerical supremacy in the region. To study the case, I examined CIA and State Department files on the program, which lasted from 1972 until 1975 and involved small, covert shipments of military and humanitarian aid through Iran, an American ally and the Kurds' principal benefactor. My results suggest that even when incentives point towards the efficacy of intervention, those incentives are largely based on the fulfillment of strategic objectives and not on stopping ethnic replacement. While the diplomatic record suggests that American knowledge of practices of Arabization, or the transplanting of Arab Iraqis in areas of contention between Kurds and Arabs, the term was primarily used in memoranda to describe comments made by Kurds. Indeed, the Americans were reluctant to intervene at all. It usually took an appeal from the Shah of Iran for the Americans to consider providing additional support. This idea was reinforced when the US pushed back against offensive measures taken by the Kurds in cities that were being Arabized, such as Kirkuk, because the US wanted the Kurds to simply act as a pressure to Baghdad and not to overrun the country. Finally, when the conflict concluded with a détente between Iran and Iraq, the US knew that Arabization would occur. Yet, since incentives had changed due to the Iranian departure, the US decided to pull out anyway. One key lesson provided by this analysis is the reminder that interest trumped normative behaviors in international politics. To this end, some may note that a change in norms, such as the passage of the Right to Protect resolution at the United Nations, might lead to stronger actions against ethnic replacement. However, the relative inaction of the United States and other hegemonic actors to stop ethnic replacement practices in Myanmar during the recent Rohingya crisis in 2017 shows the limits of norms and the enduring power of interests to shape state behavior. Therefore, I find that hegemonic powers will rarely intervene in cases of ethnic replacement unless either a confluence of interests or a well-coordinated set of policies encouraging cooperation among hegemonic powers permit limited action, thereby suggesting that the creation of further norms is unlikely to change the calculations of actors such as the US, China, and Russia. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Dylan. So it's a really fascinating finding that the US's perceived security interests dominated human rights concerns when it came to the American response to the maltreatment of the Kurdish peoples by the Iraqi regime. And that work is built on a lot of archival digging to find actual sort of diplomatic, not only cables, but the discussions within the foreign policy making team during the period when this event was occurring. And one of the things that's interesting about the project is that even though you're talking about a time period which is in the middle of the Cold War, where we might think interests are very clear, you also extend your work past the end of the Cold War, and you push back against the implication that the end of the Cold War combined with this normative prohibition, or at least an emerging norm against demographic engineering or ethnic replacement, might encourage states to act in a less self-interested fashion. What I wanted to know in following up on this is how much you think leader traits might matter. Does that matter at all? And the reason I ask is because one of the cases that you just described, the Rohingya case, occurred during an administration in the United States that hasn't been particularly friendly to human rights or concerned about foreign intervention. But let's imagine that we get a different kind of regime in the United States, a different president. Would that matter very much based on the work that you've done?
To some extent, I think so. But I think if we look at, for example, the administration of Bill Clinton during the 1990s and his evolution on this issue, during his administration, the Bosnian War still occurred, the massacre at Srebrenica still occurred, and the Rwandan genocide still occurred, even though his administration was dedicated to human rights or had some greater demonstrated interest in human rights. It really wasn't until the NATO intervention in Kosovo towards the end of his administration that we see anything close to resembling a humanitarian intervention in order to prevent ethnic replacement practices. So it would seem to me that even in a more ideal case, even with more ideal leaders who are more inclined to support these types of interventions, we really don't see leader traits emerging as much as we would consider structural traits of the international system to take precedence.
Great. Thanks, Dylan, for the very thoughtful response to my question. Last and certainly not least, we have Natalie Sands. Natalie's honors thesis is entitled Inequity in Accommodations, Minimizing Bias in Higher Education Disability Services. Thanks, Natalie.
So my project looks specifically at the population of individuals in universities that make decisions about the accommodations that are afforded to students with disabilities who access higher education. And the reason that this kind of project is really important is that the number of students with disabilities who are accessing higher education in the United States is growing every year exponentially. But when we look at specifically Black students with disabilities and Black individuals with disabilities, we see these huge disparities. We see higher levels of unemployment, we see lower income, and we see lower attainment of higher education. And so the question that spurred this project is that we know that there's institutional and structural racism that's built into the education system, and that there's severe inaccess. but are there individual biases that are altering the accommodations that are afforded to Black students with disabilities? And in addition, do disability service administrators make decisions about accommodations that take into account race and disability type? In addition, how can we start to counteract some of these biases and actually lead to actionable results? So the way that we did this is that I did a survey experiment of these actual disability service administrators, and we collected contact information from around 3,000 schools around the country. My amazing research assistants just hammered away at this. It is not easy work, and I am incredibly grateful to their work. And through this survey experiment, we used hypothetical vignettes. So essentially, I constructed this email that was from a student with a disability that said, "Hi, I am Dalton White, and I'm looking to attend your university and receive accommodations." And through this hypothetical vignette, we varied 3 things. So I varied race. The student was either Black or white. I varied disability. The student either had ADHD or they had a visual impairment that amounted to blindness, so they would need accommodations for that. And I also varied work ethic. So the student either said, "I was just voted as the hardest working in my high school class," or there was no mention of work ethic. And the reason that we chose this specific disability type, ADHD versus blindness, is there's a lot of research that shows that physical disabilities are seen as more deserving, tend to be perceived as more deserving of accommodations, and also have higher levels of likeness towards them. So are rated higher on warmth and competence measures. And so this is really important in kind of trying to figure out what factors play a role in how disability administrators make decisions. So specifically, we looked at 3 categories of outcome variables. After they were shown these particular vignettes, they were asked about their attitudes towards a particular student. They were asked about the process the student would have to go through in order to receive accommodations. So this was the documentation that they would have to provide in order to receive accommodations, and the likelihood that the administrator thought they would receive accommodations. And finally, I asked about specific accommodations. So what accommodations would this individual receive? And that's kind of the final outcome measure. So we have 3 sets there. And interestingly, our first 2 outcome measures showed a lot of variance. When we looked at deservingness, I saw that white students were seen as far more deserving of accommodations than Black students. I saw that students with blindness and visual impairment were seen as far more deserving of accommodations than students with ADHD. When we looked at documentation, saw that Black students were less likely to receive accommodations if they were to only submit a self-report. In addition, students with ADHD, a self-report was not sufficient in order to grant them accommodations. So this kind of started to paint a very clear picture of the diverging paths that these students would have to encounter in order to receive accommodations. It's important to keep in mind in this process that students with disabilities show up on campus and are encountered with a bureaucratic process that is very different than they encountered in high school. They're not only entering an environment that's not built for them, higher education is not built for students with disabilities, but also they don't have structural support that they may have had at home through their parents or through other therapists. So creating these mounting barriers for Black students, for students with ADHD, presents a severe concern that they're receiving inequitable treatment and therefore are less likely to succeed in an academic environment, particularly in higher education. This is especially concerning because higher education is so clearly correlated to higher levels of income and lower levels of employment. So finally, we looked at this accommodation where we saw no difference, but then we varied work ethic. Work ethic was the final variable that we varied. And when we added work ethic to the vignettes, these biases against race and against disability were highly vitiated. They were mitigated. And so what this starts to paint a picture of is the mechanism that disability service administrators undergo when these biases are informing their decisions. They make assumptions unconsciously or consciously about the work ethic of the students they are working with. Interestingly, prior literature has showed that there are misconceptions and false correlations of laziness and poor work ethic of Black students and also students with ADHD. So this finding kind of very well lined up with the previous literature and helped us understand kind of how these stereotypes are so important in understanding the inequities we see in higher education. Finally, I asked administrators whether they had ever engaged in a racial implicit bias training, so in the last 5 years. And we had about 60% of the administrators say they had. Interestingly, this training was one of the strongest forces in mitigating racial bias. And so while I think we all kind of have these conceptions about this implicit bias training as not necessarily being incredibly helpful or not necessarily doing very much, we actually look at this, and for these wonderful individuals, I spoke with many disability service administrators in the process of designing this project, as well as other individuals who work with students with disabilities, and they have no intent on discriminating against students based on race and disability. And so this implicit bias training plays a huge role in bringing up the stereotypes they may unconsciously internalize and allowing them to address them and then take active steps to mitigate them in the process of their work. So I found that through countering these stereotypes about work ethic, and then also using this implicit bias training to bring these unconscious stereotypes to a head and allow disability service administrators to look at them face on and make decisions, keeping in mind the stereotypes that they know may be internalized, allowed a higher level of equity in their work.
Great. Thanks so much, Natalie, for sharing this important work with us today. I wanted to follow up on something that you mentioned, which is important and touches on the very last point that you made about training that has mitigated or in some cases it appears even eliminated some of the biases that were revealed in the incredibly hard survey work that you did. I observed you collecting all of this and putting together a survey. It's really remarkably determined and impressive work. And you said higher ed is not built for students with disabilities. And we might even say higher ed is not built for, particularly not well built for Black students with disabilities. So in addition to the implicit bias training, are there other things that you think, if you were to remake higher education institutions in order to make them more equitable for students with these characteristics and with these challenges, that could actually make higher ed more well built for them? Are there other things that your research suggests in addition to the bias training that might allow these institutions to serve their students more effectively and more equitably?
Yeah, that's a really great question. I think, first of all, as I discussed prior, the implicit bias training, obviously more work needs to be done on this. There is some past research, but it shows mixed results. And so we need to look specifically at higher education and think about, one, what type of implicit bias training are we implementing? How often are we implementing it? Who is taking it? And what types of other work can we use to support this training? But I think as a political scientist, when I think about how to implement real change, I start to think about what kind of policy can we create that transforms these environments into being more accessible for students with disabilities, into being more accessible for Black students, into being more accessible to marginalized communities who have so little access, and when they do arrive on these campuses and just feel burdened by the weight of, navigating environments that are so different than ones that they've encountered before. And specifically for higher education, I think thinking about federal funding is really important, because when we can actively turn funding towards programs that help marginalized communities, then we can start to actually implement changes. Especially, we have Northwestern, there's other elite institutions who have large endowments and have the ability to create these programs. And then there's a ton of really small universities that sometimes are more accessible to marginalized communities for a variety of reasons. And they don't have the funding to do that. So if we can create federal funding, right now, the kind of 3 big chunks of federal funding that go into higher education are research, Pell Grants, which are helping marginalized communities, and benefits towards veterans education. So we're starting to do that, but we've got to figure out ways to target resources towards especially smaller institutions, actively putting these resources and time and energy, administrators on the ground whose job it is to help these individuals navigate all these barriers. It is quite literally the only way to make education more accessible. I also, especially in the last few weeks, I think I've taken a step back and looked at this project in the context of what's going on right now. First, it was COVID, where we were seeing vast inequity in the rate of African Americans dying from COVID, as well as other marginalized communities. And now it is the resurgence of the Black Lives Matter movement that's unveiling inequity in these institutions that we've known has been there all along. But it takes these visual and heart-wrenching images in order for us to really feel it. And so when we look at the policing institution and the justice system and the educational institutions and the healthcare system, these inequities are built into them, and we need to figure out a way to restructure the institutions to be more accessible. But what my research shows is we also need to figure out how, as individuals who are part of these institutions, who are making decisions, who have power to affect the change of marginalized communities, how we can start to interrogate our own biases and how we can start to take responsibility for the decisions that we are making. Because I mean, a lot of these people on this Zoom call and maybe watching on YouTube are in like places where they can make really powerful decisions and they can have an impact. And each interaction that they have every day determines what kind of equitable environment they're taking. And so in a full kind of circle and turning the tables, I would like to put forward some recommended reading, because I know interrogating your biases is kind of a broad concept, not super helpful. But I'm sure this won't be new to you, but I would highly recommend White Fragility by Robin DiAngelo. It's a wonderful book, and it's helped me think about how, as a white person, as a person with privilege, as a person with a higher education, almost having a degree in political science, I will think about my role in the healthcare institution, in the educational institutions. And finally, especially for those kind of who have degrees in political science or are working in political science, I would recommend Strangers in Their Own Land. We have to realize that 50% of our country voted for a racist, sexist, homophobic man in 2016, and 50% will again in 2020. And we need to think about where these deep-seated fears and anxieties are coming from so that we can start to transform the institutions. We can't only look at our own bubble. We need to look at the broader world. We need to think more intensely about actually taking this country along as we rebuild to create an environment that's more accessible to students with disabilities, to Black students, to Indigenous communities, and all others.
Thanks so much, Natalie. And thank you all. Thank you, Jonathan, Alyssa, Patrick, Dylan, and Natalie, for sharing your time, for sharing your work with us. And we congratulate you on your accomplishments and your achievements. I'm going to turn it over now to Andrew Roberts, who's going to move to the next stage of our event. Over to you, Andrew.
Okay, thanks. Can you hear me okay? I don't think I've spoken yet. Okay. Thanks, Professor Nelson, for your heartfelt introduction, and to the honors students for their groundbreaking research. I've followed the honors program for a long time, but I don't think I've ever seen such a good set of theses. They're just really impressive. And I think that's tribute partially to Professor Nelson, and then of course to the students and their advisors as well. So yeah, congratulations on those. So my name is Andrew Roberts. I'm the associate chair of the department. I first want to echo Professor Nelson and his opening remarks, the pride that I feel in the way our students have weathered these difficult times, and the hope for the future I have, based not just on their moral compass, but the critical thinking skills that I hope they've developed through our program, and definitely from the students we just saw, they definitely have developed them. to pursue those goals. So I'm here to recognize a wider group of students for their achievements in political science and more broadly in their academic careers at Northwestern. These are students who are inducted into 2 academic honor societies known by their Greek initials. Sounds like a Jeopardy question now. What are the 2 honor societies known by, for political scientists known by their Greek initials? I'm not sure if everyone will be familiar with the first organization. It's called Pi Sigma Alpha. Unfortunately, that abbreviates to PSA, but it's not public service announcement. Pi Sigma Alpha was founded in 1920 at the University of Texas in Austin to encourage and recognize superior achievement in the study of government and politics at the undergraduate and graduate level. There are over 600 chapters and 7,000 students joining each year. It's the only recognized college honor society in the discipline of political science and one of the largest members of the Association of College Honor Societies. So students are invited each year to join Pi Sigma Alpha based on their commitment to political science and their highest classic achievement. This signals their potential to excel as citizens and scholars, which I think we just saw among the students here. With this special honor come the special obligations of leaders to exemplify and safeguard the academic aims of this university, the honesty, integrity of its scholars, and the ideals of Northwestern University. So I'm going to read the names of the students that were inducted into Pi Sigma Alpha at an event we had back in the halcyon days of February. And I apologize if I get any name pronunciations wrong. So the students I think we inducted this year, if I do miss someone, tell me. Dominic Bayer, Samuel Cole, Millie Culbertson, Grant Glazebrook, I think I saw him here. Jonathan Goldberg was there also. Looking through the names earlier. Jacob Gordon, Jane Gotham, Alyssa Gray, I saw her. Dylan Gressick, it's a little long. Lydia Hartman, Shiu Kang, Netta Kisam, Dylan Kennedy, Ahmad Keshk, Jeremy Lampstein, Mia Lennon, Sarah Letcher, Henry Mon, Jonathan Murray, Jack O'Day, Cameron Peters, Elizabeth Phillips, Davis Rich, Carter Rothman, Elizabeth Severini, Noah Spector, Jacqueline Tepper, Carolyn Werner, Jane Yun, and Jiangyun Zhang. So congratulations to all those students that became members of Pi Sigma Alpha this year, we'll have lifetime membership in that organization. So the second organization is likely better known to you. It's Phi Beta Kappa. It's the oldest and possibly the most prestigious academic honor society in the United States. It was founded in 1776 at the College of William and Mary with the goal of promoting and advocating excellence in the liberal arts and sciences. The Greek letters stand for the phrase, love of learning is the guide of life. I'll spare you my Greek pronunciation, even though I should, as a member, know it a little better. It inducts only the most outstanding students based on their high academic achievement and good moral character. And I've been part of these discussions before where we induct new members. So the following political science students were inducted into Phi Beta Kappa this past spring. There may be some from last year that we're missing, I'm not sure. Dominic Ballesteri Fox, Dominic Bayer, Samuel Cole, James Crisafulli, Grant Blazebrook, again I saw here, Mary Hawley, Ahmad Keshk, Henry Molnar, Jonathan Murray, Alexander Neumann, and Carter Rothman. So congratulations to all those students for becoming members of Phi Beta Kappa. So let me congratulate all those students for those fine achievements, and congratulations to them. And with that, I wanted to pass the baton to Professor Wendy Perlman for another set of awards that the Political Science Department gives out.
Thank you so much, Professor Roberts, and thank you all for being here, staff, faculty, students. I want to reiterate my huge congratulations for everyone, and like my colleagues, have been tremendously impressed and inspired by the performance of our students during this most difficult of years, how people have demonstrated their eagerness for learning and intellectual curiosity and hard work, despite so many difficulties and distractions and circumstances has truly been a lesson and an inspiration for me that I'm grateful to you all to allow me to carry forward. So all of our students are tremendous, and I'm here to read the names of awardees for a few awards who've been inspire us among those who are inspiring for us. But to reiterate that we really have so many more students who are deserving awards than the names we're able to recognize now. But to go on with these awards. So the first award that I'm so delighted and honored to present is the Kenneth F. Janda Prize for Distinguished Honors Thesis in Political Science. This is named in recognition of his 41-year career in the Political Science Department and the hundreds of Northwestern graduates that he advised. The Kenneth F. Janda Prize is awarded for the best undergraduate honors thesis of the year. The winner is selected by the Honors Committee and is based on the nominations and feedback received from the honors thesis readers. You've all now had the pleasure to hear all of our honors thesis writers present their outstanding work, so you know that they're all worthy of prizes. It was no easy decision for the committee, I'm sure, to choose these top theses to award and recognize. But I'd like to start with the honorable mention, which goes to Jonathan Goldberg for his thesis, Game of Drones, the effect of drone strikes on terrorist tactical diversity. And the top winner for best thesis of the year goes to Natalie Sands for her thesis, Inequity and Accommodations, Minimizing Bias in Higher Education Disability Services. So a hearty congratulations to Jonathan and to Natalie, and a hearty congratulations to all of our thesis writers this year. The second prize I'm proud to announce is the William M. McGovern Award for Academic Excellence, Leadership, and Citizenship. And this is named for Professor McGovern's devotion to his students and for making significant strides to enhance academic life in the Political Science Department. This prize is awarded to outstanding graduating political science majors who have demonstrated excellence in scholarship, leadership, and university citizenship. So again, I'll begin with our honorable mention to Henry Mullner. Henry is graduating with majors in political science, history, and international studies. During his time at Northwestern, Henry served as a senator, parliamentarian, and chief of staff for Northwestern's Associated Student Government. As chief of staff, he was able to help lead ASG's COVID-19 response and led financial reform efforts to begin a precedent of donating leftover ASG finances toward campus-wide charitable initiatives, including Books for Cats. And our winner of the McGovern Award for Academic Excellence, Leadership, and Citizenship goes to Alyssa Gray. Alyssa is graduating with majors in political science and journalism and a minor in gender and sexuality studies. During her time at Northwestern, Alyssa held leadership positions with Campus Kitchens, Alpha Phi Omega Service Fraternity, and SHAPE, Sexual Health and Assault Peer Educators. Alyssa is a Truman Scholar and is attending UC Berkeley Law in the fall. And of course, you just heard her present her research as well. The next prize is the R. Barry Farrell Prize for Academic Achievement in Political Science. And this is named for Professor Farrell's outstanding commitment to undergraduate students, both within and beyond the classroom. The R. Barry Farrell Prize for Academic Achievement in Political Science is given to and in recognition of a student for the best written undergraduate research seminar paper. So we invite faculty members to nominate a paper that was really exceptional in their Poli-Sci 395 or other seminars, and the committee chooses essentially the best paper of the year. And here our winner is Grant Glazebrook. Grant is receiving this paper, or this award for his paper, titled Trains to Opportunity or Trains to Nowhere, Assessing the Impact of Suburban Racial Attitudes on Public Transit's Potential to Address Inner City Concentrated Poverty. He wrote this paper for Professor Ruel Rogers' research seminar, Racial Politics in American Cities, and it was a real standout of a paper, and merited our praise and recognition. Next is the Frank N. and Lee L. Corbin Prize, Political Science nominee. So this is a WCAS prize, but we want to give recognition to the political sciences nomination. So each year, Weinberg College of Arts and Sciences awards the Frank N. and Lee L. Corbin Prize to seniors with outstanding academic records who plan to attend graduate or professional school at Northwestern. While not all students who are nominated by their respective departments receive an award at the college level, just to be selected as a nominee is itself an honor. So we wanted to recognize that our nominee for as the political science department goes again to Grant Glazebrook. As we mentioned, Grant, whose paper won the prize for best seminar paper, is graduating with a major in poli-sci and a minor in legal studies. Grant will attend Northwestern's Pritzker School of Law in the fall. Weinberg College will announce the winner of the Corbin Prize soon, but we're really proud to recognize Grant as our department's nominee. And then finally, we'd like to announce the Poli-Sci Senior Marshal. So each department in Weinberg College chooses one graduating senior to be the standard bearer at the Weinberg College convocation. The senior marshal would normally carry the major's banner during commencement and lead their majors across the stage. Well, unfortunately, there is no banner to carry this year and no marching across stages. We're still really excited to recognize our department's senior marshal with this symbolic honor. And our senior marshal winner is Mary Pedraza. Mary graduated in fall 2019 with majors in political science and international studies. Mary has already started pursuing her master's degree in library and information science. While at Northwestern, Mary served on the political science department's undergraduate council, in Northwestern University's Wildcat Marching Band, in the Sigma Alpha Lambda music fraternity, and she was also an intern at the Block Museum of Art. So thank you to everyone, to those who submitted applications. They were all beyond impressive, and the heartiest of congratulations to this year's winners. You make us all proud. If we were in person, we would invite you to the stage to shake a hand, to give you a certificate, to have you all have your moment in front of in front of us all. I'm not sure if there's any way for us to do that in Zoom, but if you are a winner of that award, perhaps you can raise your hand, give a bow, and wave to the crowd, so we all know you're here, as many of you are on the stage. So take a second to shine in the spotlight. We can all clap and say how proud we are of you. And I think with that, I will pass the baton on to the chair of the department, Will Reno, for some concluding remarks.
All right, thank you very much, Wendy, and congratulations, class of 2020. Good to see you here online, and just remind you that we'll have a chance to meet in person, and that'll be around this time next year, because we got the message from Morty that we've got a in-person graduation, so I'm calling it class of 2020 2.0. So that should be a really big event, in which we'll have another opportunity to congratulate you. So I'm Will Reno, and I'm chair of the department. So I'm here to offer the benediction as we close out this ceremony. So tap of the political science chapeau to all of you, and to all of your accomplishments. Some of you I know fairly well, and others I'd say for all, I've enjoyed listening to you and hearing your account of your work. And I think that the presentations here have been more interesting than some that I even hear at academic conferences. So I give you a hand for that. I'd also like to thank our excellent staff. So I think most of this, or I'd say all of this, would really not be possible without the organizational efforts of Stephen Montero and Courtney Siskowski and Libby Waite and Erica Canavan. So a lot of thanks to all of you. And I think students, those of you who know our excellent staff, and maybe those of you who don't, appreciate all of the efforts. And I mean, without you, none of this would be possible. Just a brief comment about the class of 2020. A lot of times, there's that sort of trite thing about the end of the school year, and you're in elementary school and the teacher said, "You're the best class I've ever had." And by about 6th grade, you wonder, haven't I heard that before? But I think you're the best class we've ever had. But I'll tell you why. And that is that your class is pretty distinct and different. And I think you know why. And I don't know many other classes that have been dealing with pandemics, at least not in recent years, and major civic events that we've seen on television, and the activism surrounding that. And then, a fair bit of political turmoil, and, who knows what we got between now and November. So I have to acknowledge the resilience that I've seen just in my discussions with students on scientific example, but I'm impressed with the extent to which students that I've interacted with, it's people are frustrated and impatient, I think, like all of us, about restrictions and disappointments about missed opportunities. But I think that I see a fair bit of optimism among students, and it's more about how to find opportunities in problems, and how to manage, how to plan some sort of contingency fashion and so forth. Which is really important, because around us, oftentimes we'll see people in leadership that'll sometimes take gloomier view, and it's not necessarily that they know more, but I think that we can learn from students, and I've appreciated seeing the resilience of undergraduates around me. Also, just speaking to the current events, I appreciate those of you who've been able to participate in the town hall meetings that we've had, and this has been discussions around George Floyd's murder and the events surrounding that. And in this, I see, certainly, I mean, we acknowledge people's rights to be upset, and as political scientists, we don't have all of the answers, but I commend you and the others who've participated in these events for playing important role in a larger process, and that's a process of discussion in a democratic society. And that's what we hope to be a part of. And this is something for the long haul, not just words, platitudes for a specific event. So that's also an invitation to all of you. Use all that braininess that you have, your analytical skills, abilities, and so forth, and help us to work it out, to figure out what to do for the future. And there'll be other opportunities in the future, and we've been discussing, particularly for undergraduates, to be able to engage, or I should say alumni. But you can be a part of that as well. And I think that as an educator, this has been part of the most enjoyable aspects of the association with all of you. And that is, it's not just about learning and what do you got to know to take that exam and do well on it and so forth, but it's also part of political science as it fits in a liberal arts ideal. And that is to think about it in terms of citizenship. And I think as educators, one of the things we think about is educating the student to be really the best person that they have the capability to be. And that's partly about classroom, but it's also something that's integral to the workshops that we've been holding and other ways that we're trying to figure out how to engage in the future. And again, that's an invitation to you also as alumni, because you're not at graduation 2.0 yet. So you'll have the credential and so forth, but you're always part of our community and so forth. And so with that invitation to 2.0, I think it's probably appropriate. I could do the big e-hug, and that's socially distanced, of course. And with that, really, that's my final word. And unless anybody's got something else to say, maybe one of the students, we're a small group here. Student want to have a final word? Close it out? Or do we give a round of applause to all of us? So that's the end of my remarks. I think there's ice cream out in the patio somewhere in some imaginary world, but we'll redeem that promise in a year's time. So until then, take care and good luck, and look forward to when a lot of these problems that we think about these days are in the rearview mirror.
Thank you, Will, and thank you all for coming. I hope that you have enjoyed this session. And if you are able to stay on the call for just a little bit more, we can continue to wrap up. So thank you, YouTube. Just